15 blasts were heard. The electricity grid was struck, leading to partial power outages, and some of the water pumps stopped functioning. No deaths have been reported. Now, all around the world, water crises are fueling conflict and driving inequality and migration. That's according to the latest UN report, which urges countries to increase cooperation to help preserve peace. Here's our environment editor, Nick Clark.
This is the UN's flagship report on the state of the world's freshwater resources, and it doesn't paint a pretty picture. Today, 2.2 billion people live without access to safely managed drinking water, and approaching half of the world's population do not have adequate or safe sanitation. Indeed, in poorer countries, up to 90% of wastewater is discharged directly into the environment without treatment. Every single day around the world, 1,000 children die from illnesses caused by contaminated drinking water. All this drives migration as millions move in search of fresh and safe supplies, adding further strain on resources where the migrants settle, fueling social tensions. An armed conflict can have near catastrophic impacts on civilian water infrastructure. Think of the targeted attacks on storage and treatment plants in Ukraine, in Gaza, and in Sudan. As climate change adds to the strain on water supply, the UN report calls for a global effort to provide water equally for everyone. It is, after all, a human right.
Let's get more on this with Quentin Grafton. He's a professor and convener of the Water Justice Hub at the Australian National University. He also holds the UNESCO Chair in Water Economics. He joins us now from Sydney. Thank you for your time. What are the main issues putting stress on the world's water supply, in your opinion?
Well, the outcomes were well discussed in the introduction. Namely, we've got too much, too little, and too dirty water. Too much, of course, in flooding. We saw that in Pakistan a couple of years ago. We're seeing it in all sorts of different places in the world. We're seeing it in terms of too little water, ongoing droughts in a variety of places in the world, including East Africa at the moment. And, of course, too dirty. Too dirty water is all over the place. We've lost wetlands to a great extent since 1970. About a third, perhaps, of our wetlands have been lost. So, yes, this is an ongoing outcome of drivers. The drivers being economic growth, the drivers being population growth, the drivers being poverty, of course, and lack of justice. So those are the drivers. We see the outcomes. We have to do something about it, because it's not just a water problem for people in Syria. It's not just a water problem for people in Sudan or wherever you may be. It's a water problem for all of us, because we grow our food with fresh water, whether it's irrigated or whether it's rain-fed. And when we have climate change on top of already existing water crisis, then we have the inability to feed ourselves in the coming decades. So this is a crisis for the world. It's a crisis that needs fixing, and it's a crisis that can be fixed.
Right, and you talked about growing food. I mean, growing food is massively water intense, isn't it? I mean, to what extent are food security and water security linked?
They're absolutely linked. So in terms of freshwater extractions, about 70% of the world's water extracted from groundwater, from streams and from rivers goes into irrigated agriculture. And a high percentage, maybe 80 to 85%, is actually consumed by agriculture. So you can't get a bigger issue than agriculture, food and fiber and water. And of course, not every place in the world grows food for export. There's some critically important locations in the world: North India, Pakistan, Northern China, Western United States, parts of Western Europe. They provide exports of food. Australia, the country where I live, and other places as well. So those key locations, some of them are going to become much more critically challenged by water. In the place where I live, which is Australia, we have issues around flooding, massive flooding events the last couple of years. And of course, there's droughts. We just got out of a drought in 2019. Those issues exist in northern India in the context of over-extraction of groundwater. There are issues around northern China. There have been massive investments to transfer from hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of water from the south to the north. And of course, the Western United States has a whole set of issues, particularly around groundwater, but also surface water in the Colorado River. So all of these are issues that are getting worse. They're not getting better. And those are critically critically important places in terms of food production. And I also want to add, and I don't want to neglect this because it's extremely important, I have access to safe drinking water 24/7. Many people in the world, billions of people, don't have access to safe water and sanitation. That needs to be fixed. It can be fixed. The challenge is to deliver into rural locations and remote communities in particular. We even have remote communities in Australia which don't have access to drinking water that meets the Australian drinking water guidelines.
Apologies for getting in there. I mean, you said...
Not at all.
You said get the water, transfer the water to poorer communities. I mean, if there's no incentive to do that, I mean, how do you go about doing that?
Well, you need support. Obviously, these communities can't just do it themselves. They're part of the solution. They need to be listened to. So when we talk about access to safe drinking water and sanitation in rural communities, it needs to be fit for purpose, for place and for people. So, for example, you can have them be contributors to the operations and maintenance costs, but you need governments, you need donors, you need others to provide the capital structure because they can't afford that. And you need to have results contracts. There needs to be transparency about the quality of the water and people who are actually delivering the operations and maintenance. If it's not themselves, and
apologies
sure
again.
They get paid only if they deliver.
Right. And what is the likelihood of all that happening? I mean, I understand water privatization has increased significantly over the last decade. I mean, who's going to make all these things happen if governments don't?
Well, water privatization is not going to solve the world water crisis. Okay, so let me be very clear about that. What's going to make it happen is people, whether they live in cities or whether they live in rural areas, actually contacting, being part of the action to make sure there are resources dedicated to fix our water problems and protect our watersheds. That's how it's going to happen. It's not going to happen from privatization. So it's going to happen from people working together to make sure that the public interest and publicly good outcomes happen. And that requires mobilizing resources as well as people. And let me tell you that we can make this happen. We can deliver these solutions. This is not mission impossible. Of course, it will take years, but it can be done. And they're good examples. They're good examples of programs which have worked in rural and remote communities that have delivered safe drinking water, for example. We can scale up and scale out some of these programs, keeping in mind that it always has to be context specific, fit for purpose, fit for people, and fit for place.
Okay, I appreciate you talking to us on Al Jazeera. Quentin Grafton, Professor and Convener of the Water Justice Hub. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Still ahead on Al Jazeera. The Chief Minister of India's capital is arrested weeks before general elections. His party says the charges are fabricated.
In an increasingly complex world, it's paramount to be direct.
This is such a watershed moment. International law is being completely dismantled.
Unfiltered discussions that cut through the noise.
Israel operates under a climate of absolute impunity.
We challenge conventional wisdom. How does it affect you? How does it affect the community?
It sends a message that anti-Arab bigotry, that Islamophobia, that these are acceptable forms of hate.
Up front on Al Jazeera.
Families in Gaza are facing unimaginable hardships. During times of crisis, solidarity is our strongest defense against injustice. And we've been in Gaza since 1991 doing life-saving work. Your generosity can provide vital support to those worst affected, because in their darkest hour, your mercy shines brightest. Give mercy now. Donate today.
watching Al Jazeera reminder of our top stories this hour. Hundreds of displaced Palestinians have fled Gaza City as Israel's offensive focuses on the Strip's biggest medical facility. The army has threatened to blow up Al-Shifa Hospital, even though many people are still inside. The U.S. Secretary of State says gaps are narrowing in negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza. Antony Blinken met with foreign ministers in Egypt. On Friday, the UN Security Council is set to vote on a U.S. draft resolution on an immediate ceasefire. The European Union says it is looking at using profits from frozen Russian assets to finance military aid for Ukraine. Speaking at a leaders' summit in Brussels, European Council President Charles Michel said the bloc is speeding up its military support for Kyiv. Aid agencies are calling on the international community to do more to prevent famine in Sudan. Millions are facing starvation there after almost a year of fighting between the army and paramilitary rapid support forces. Tens of thousands of people have been killed. Ibn Morgan has more from Khartoum.
The humanitarian situation for people trapped in the capital Khartoum and elsewhere around the country where there's fighting between the RSF and the Sudanese army is quite catastrophic and dire. Now, the United Nations says that it cannot access millions and millions of civilians who are in desperate need of humanitarian assistance, and at least 5 million are just one step away from famine. And that's because of access to areas where civilians are trapped and where aid agencies cannot get security clearances to be able to reach those in need. But there's also the issue of the economy itself that has been affected by the conflict. For nearly a year now, many people who had jobs have not been able to earn their salaries, and therefore they do not have that purchasing power to be able to afford food and other basic necessities from shops and markets. So that has affected their ability to be able to put food on the table and has contributed to the number of people in desperate need of humanitarian assistance and facing hunger here in the capital and elsewhere around the country. Food commodities are also unable to move freely between markets, even in places that are stable. Now, the conflict has also affected Sudan's breadbasket, the state of Jazeera in central Sudan. The RSF took over the state, or at least a large part of the state, in December, and that has affected farmers' ability to be able to supply the market with crops and vegetables for people to be able to buy. That has led to scarcity. So even the few food commodities in the market is now more expensive. And again, because of the economy or the war economy, people can no longer afford to buy food. The United Nations Security Council has called for a ceasefire to be observed during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. But fighting continues between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary rapid support forces. On Tuesday and Wednesday, there were intense clashes between the two sides as the RSF tried to take over a Sudanese army base in the city of Bahri in the northern part of the capital, Khartoum. So while the two sides fight each other, both are not heeding to the calls of the United Nations Security Council.